Hello, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
I'm Chad Cicciodello.
This week, Obamagate. President Trump says it's worse than Watergate. We'll take a look.
We're going to have a lot to say about unmasking and not the surgical kind.
And voting rights in the time of a pandemic. We'll find out what's being done to ensure access to the ballot in November and what's being done to try and block that access. But first, President Trump toured another face mask factory earlier today without wearing a face mask. This time it was in the swing state of Pennsylvania, where he announced plans to restock America's strategic reserve of protective equipment in the aftermath of this pandemic. And he is also blaming the Obama administration for not restocking after the 2009 swine flu.
It was a pandemic in 2009 that was not well handled at all, got very poor marks. Never again will another president inherit empty shelves or expired products, at least hopefully in 5 years you're talking about, maybe 9 years, maybe 13 years, but you'll never have to deal with empty shelves.
John, who marks a pandemic?
I'm not sure. Maybe it's just public opinion, but yeah, it's a good question. The fact checkers, by the way, have looked at that claim of empty shelves when Trump arrived and since then, and they found it is, quote, mostly false, although 85 million masks were distributed in 2009, and both the Obama administration and Congress did make cuts to funding what is an $8 billion national stockpile. Experts say the supply of the N95 masks should have been replenished at some point, but they do suggest that the money was there to buy masks when they were needed, but that this administration acted too slowly. Meanwhile, earlier today, the former head of America's top vaccine agency, Dr. Rick Bright, appeared before a House committee hearing, and he claimed the Trump administration repeatedly ignored his warnings of the looming pandemic in January and February, failed to stock up on protective equipment, lacked an overall plan of action, and then put too much emphasis on the unproven and potentially dangerous drug hydroxychloroquine.
When you look at the first 4 months of this year, would you describe the government's and the administration's response as a success or a failure?
I believe we could have done better. I believe there are critical steps that we did not take in time.
And Dr. Bright says it's a shame the Trump administration ignored the existing pandemic plan left for them by the previous administration. And he says that now time is running out. The Trump administration still doesn't have a plan for testing, contract tracing, or how to roll out a vaccine if and when one becomes available, Chaz.
And that is a big deal, rolling out the vaccine, because people think as soon as the vaccine is invented, great, no problems. But there's a big difference between emergency use of a vaccine and rolling out the hundreds of millions of doses you need for the general public.
We're talking about it costing maybe $900 billion to vaccinate all Americans.
Yeah. There was a quote in one of the papers that I've got note here from Michael Osterlin, who's the director of the University of Minnesota's Center for Infectious Diseases Research and Policy. And he said, quote, "I don't think the general population will have a vaccine probably until the second half of 2021, and that's if everything works out okay." He meant if it's discovered this year.
Right.
He said it'll take a year to roll out. And I don't think people are assuming that at all. No. The other thing about vaccines, which I don't think people take in consideration, which needs to be planned for, is there's a lot of superstition about vaccines out there. We joke about it, but it's real. There was a YouGov poll just this week. 55% of people said they would take a vaccine if it was available.
Wow.
19% said they definitely would not. That's not an effective vaccine if 19% of people aren't taking it.
Yeah, and if there's a perception that the vaccine has been rushed and that there could be side effects, and this is going to be, taken literally by billions of people around the world. So if there are any adverse reactions and so on, then clearly misinformation or just genuine concerns about it could spread very quickly.
We need a vaccine for conspiracy theories, I think. But let's move to slightly less depressing numbers.
Good.
Because the COVID trends right now are actually improving. These are the new daily cases up to yesterday. There are another 25,000 cases today, but that is about 5,000 fewer new cases than there have been on a Thursday for the last few weeks, which is why that 7-day average line is starting to gradually fall, finally. And even if we remove the tri-state area, so that's new cases there you're seeing, without New York, without New Jersey, without Connecticut, that's where all the cases are, it looks like the rest of America might have peaked. Over to deaths, and there is a definite slope downwards on daily deaths in America as well. Today saw another 1,700 deaths, which is about 1,000 fewer than there were on the Thursday the last few weeks. And if we take out the New York tri-state area again, that 7-day average may also have peaked. So that is good news. In terms of how states are going individually, according to the New York Times, there are now only 5 states that still have increasing caseloads of COVID patients: Arkansas, Maine, Montana, South Dakota and Virginia, whereas there are 22 states with steady caseloads and 23 states with decreasing caseloads. And that is while tests are continuing to increase, so theoretically they should be discovering a higher proportion of COVID cases, so that is good news. Unfortunately, while these numbers are positive, they're not positive enough for the administration, with news this week that the administration is pushing the CDC for revisions that could lead to far fewer deaths being counted. They still exist, just not counted. In particular, Deborah Birx apparently wants the CDC to exclude from the official death count people who have either not have confirmed positive tests but were presumed positive, and those who may have had the virus but were judged to have not died as a direct result of it. The old getting run over with COVID type examples. Now, I don't doubt that there are people being counted as COVID deaths who were not actually COVID deaths. Of course, it's a big bureaucracy, it's hard to manage everything 100%. But I do remind you that a Yale study found that in March alone, there were about 15,000 more deaths than you would usually have in America, but only 8,000 of them were officially registered as COVID deaths. So not all of those 7,000 extra deaths would have been COVID related, but a fair whack of them would have been. So they probably are undercounting, despite all that. Infectious diseases expert Anthony Fauci had this to say about the official death count of 80,000.
Most of us feel that the number of deaths are likely higher than that number because given the situation, particularly in New York City, when they were really strapped with a very serious challenge to their healthcare system, that there may have been people who died at home who did have COVID, who were not counted as COVID because they never really got to the hospital. I don't know exactly what percent's higher, but almost certainly it's higher.
Yeah, at the end of the day, of course, we're probably never going to have a singular number because just as they say with the Spanish flu pandemic of 100 years ago, the death toll was between 50 and 100 million, maybe more. Nobody is entirely sure. Well, it was on Tuesday this week that Dr. Fauci was questioned by the Republican-dominated Senate Health Committee, and he was trying to tread a very diplomatic line, but he also sounded several notes of caution about the region's reopening, particularly schools as well as businesses that are just opening up too early, he says.
If some areas, cities, states, or what have you, jump over those various checkpoints and prematurely open up, my concern is that we will start to see little spikes that might turn into outbreaks, which in fact, paradoxically, will set you back, not only leading to some suffering and death that could be avoided, but could even set you back on the road to trying to get economic recovery.
It's a fairly tactful, cautionary note there, but earlier today the President was asked about those comments and he took something of a swipe at his top health advisor.
Dr. Fauci yesterday was a little cautious on reopening the economy too soon. Do you share his concern?
About reopening what?
Reopening the economy too soon, some states.
Look, he wants to play all sides of the equation. I think we're going to have a tremendous fourth quarter. I think we're going to have a transitional third quarter. And I think we're going to have a phenomenal next year.
When you say Dr. Fauci is playing both sides, are you suggesting that the advice he's giving to you is different?
I was surprised by his answer, actually, because, it's just, to me, it's not an acceptable answer, especially when it comes to schools.
Which is really interesting, the way in which President Trump is now trying to separate the economic from the health and to even criticise Dr. Fauci for saying, well, there are economic implications for underestimating the health risks now, as in the consequences are not just in lives but also in money. Trying to talk the President's language, but essentially the President saying, don't talk my language on the economy. I'll handle that, Doctor. Yeah,
well, there's a lot of tension in this issue, schools in particular, because you cannot reopen the economy if schools aren't in session because parents can't work if their kids are at home. So, and everyone knows that kids aren't getting it. So this is a critical area. And the worst part, which Fauci alluded to a little bit there, is if there is a spike, they may not be able to reclose. We're assuming if there's a spike, then they'll reclose. But Jared Kushner, just this week in the interview, said he doesn't think they can reclose once they open. So if they open, they might be open for good. And if there's a spike, they'll just have to live with it, and it could be a big spike. Yeah. And I can't emphasise enough as well that they really need to get this right, because people are suffering. And I'm not sure if you've seen the lines outside food banks at the moment.
Sure. Yeah.
But yeah, like I've got a clip of it right here. They just go forever. These are the cars outside just a typical food bank. Food banks are basically, we're talking thousands of people there just lining up. Food banks are basically going at twice the rate that they were before at the moment, even with all the stimulus. People aren't coping. And
so these are places, they're kind of like grocery stores, but it's where people who get food stamps as a form of welfare can go and get food supplies at these times, and they're sometimes subsidised by charities and stuff.
Yeah, the food banks in particular are for free for people who can't afford, even with food stamps. So that they're basically charity, and you can see how many people need charity. But let's not forget as well, something which I keep on saying all the time, it's not the president who decides when they go back to work. There's another graph out about small businesses that are open at the moment. If you have a look there, that since the middle of April, they got down to 50% of small businesses were closed. Now, with all these places reopening, 40% of small businesses are closed compared to pre-pandemic. So people just aren't reopening, no matter what anyone says. Yep. So we just got to wait for people to get comfortable, and let's hope they make the right decision.
Yeah, and of course, a lot of these businesses are also laying off people in large numbers as well. So what reopening actually looks like is going to be very interesting to see.
It will.
All right, now to
Obamagate.
That's right. This week, President Trump attached the infamous gate suffix to his presidential predecessor.
Obamagate makes Watergate look smart time.
Golly, Watergate brought down Richard Nixon. So what is it?
Obamagate.
Yes, but 12 times this week, starting with Mother's Day, President Trump tweeted about Obamagate. 4 times. It was just that single word.
Obamagate.
Okay, we're all dying to know. What is Obamagate? Over to you, Phil Rucker of The Washington Post.
Mr. President, in one of your Mother's Day tweets, you appear to accuse President Obama of the biggest political crime in American history by far. Those were your words. What crime exactly are you accusing President Obama of committing, and do you believe the Justice Department should prosecute him?
Obamagate. It's been going on for a long time. It's been going on from before I even got elected. And it's a disgrace that it happened. And if you look at what's gone on, and if you look at now all of this information that's being released, and from what I understand, that's only the beginning. Some terrible things happened, and it should never be allowed to happen in our country again. And you'll be seeing what's going on over the coming weeks. But I wish you'd write honestly about it, but unfortunately, you choose not to do so. Yeah, John, please.
Crime. What is the crime exactly that you're accusing him of?
You know what the crime is. The crime is very obvious to everybody. All you have to do is read the newspapers, except yours.
Actually, if you read a whole lot of newspapers, they're pretty confused as well. It's disgraceful. It shouldn't have happened. But what is it? Okay, let's just put Fox News on.
What did Barack Hussein Obama know, and when did he know it? Tonight, we will unravel the biggest abuse of power scandal in American history, and it is more clear than ever before. Barack knew a lot.
Nice use of Hussein, Sean. At the heart of this Obamagate claim, it seems, former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, who you will recall had a phone call with Russia's US ambassador to the United States, Sergei Kislyak, in late December 2016. That was during the final weeks of the Obama administration. And that was the call that set off alarm bells at a time when the FBI was investigating Russian election interference and Obama had imposed sanctions. More alarm bells sounded when Flynn told a number of people, including Mike Pence and Sean Spicer, remember him, that he had not discussed sanctions against Russia with Kislyak, when in fact he had. Now, Obama had warned Trump against hiring Flynn, saw him as a bit of a loose cannon with some rather mercenary tendencies. Well, 2 weeks before leaving office, Obama met with his top security officials, and I'll let Sean Hannity take up the story.
Then President Obama held a meeting with all of his top intel and security officials. That would be Clapper, Brennan, Comey, Rice, Yates, Biden and others. And after the meeting in the Oval Office, he then pulled both FBI Director James Comey and the Deputy Attorney General Sally Yates aside for the purpose of discussing Flynn.
Now, Flynn discussing sanctions with Sergei Kislyak wasn't necessarily a huge problem. Technically, a breach of the old Logan Act, which stops private citizens acting like diplomats. But nobody ever uses the Logan Act, and he was about to become National Security Advisor anyway. Still, the FBI was worried that Flynn was lying to members of the Trump team about what was said in that call, so that Mike Pence and Sean Spicer were out there making false denials on Flynn's behalf, making all of them possible targets of Russian blackmail, which also seems a bit of a stretch, but whatever. Given the Russians had tried to help Trump win the election, and Trump kept saying weirdly nice things about Vladimir Putin, it did look a little bit fishy. 4 days after Trump took office, with Flynn as his national security advisor now, FBI agents interviewed Michael Flynn about the Kislyak call. Flynn again denied talking about sanctions in the call, even though the agents quoted bits of the call to Flynn, so he must have known they'd been bugging the whole call. They always bug Russian ambassadors. Bottom line, though, the FBI knew Flynn was lying. After some details of that call were made public, Flynn was caught in the lie and he resigned from the Trump administration in mid-February. He later pleaded guilty to lying to the FBI before withdrawing that plea deal that he'd made with Special Counsel Robert Mueller last year. But then, of course, last week, the Department of Justice announced it was dropping the charges against Flynn. Their reasoning, which has been widely criticised by literally thousands of former Department of Justice employees, was that the FBI did not have a valid reason to interview Flynn. It hasn't ended there, though, because the judge in the case has called a further review and asked for an amicus brief. He says that Flynn twice pleaded guilty before the court before withdrawing that guilty plea, and that could in itself be contempt of court. And so, with all of that as background, we come to the President and Sean Hannity this week ramping up Obamagate, a unifying theory of a potentially grand conspiracy. Seems to have been triggered perhaps by the release last weekend of audio of President Obama from a Zoom call with his former staffers where he criticised the dropping of the Flynn case.
The fact that there is no precedent that anybody can find for someone who's been charged with perjury. Just getting off scot-free. That's the kind of stuff where you begin to get worried that basic, not just institutional norms, but our basic understanding of rule of law is at risk.
He got the charge wrong. Mm-hmm. He was charged with lying to the FBI. Doesn't inspire lots of confidence.
Yeah, well, look, watching Sean Hannity's detailing of this alleged deep state conspiracy this week is probably not that much more enlightening than when Phil Rucker was asking President Trump about so-called Obamagate. But very generally, it does seem to be the idea that Flynn was set up by Barack Obama, and Jim Comey was in on it, and a bunch of never-Trump Republicans, Clapper and Brennan, and everyone was raising concerns about Trump's ties with Russia. They wanted to destroy Trump's presidency, and they very nearly did through the Mueller inquiry. The president keeps suggesting there's more to come, which could well be a tease of the findings of John Durham, who's the US attorney, who's heading a review into the foundations of the Russia probe. Was it premised on good intelligence, or was it all, on Steele dossier rubbish? The possibility that Trump's Justice Department may start indicting former Obama officials is very real, though. President Trump has called on Congress to force Obama to testify, and they're talking about 50-year jail sentences for these people involved in the conspiracy. Meanwhile, Obamagate seems to be Trump's way of trying to prove this whole thing was indeed a hoax. Even though, of course, Russia certainly helped Trump win. They were trying to help him to win. That's the assessment of the 17 intelligence agencies, and that Trump gladly accepted that assistance. But ultimately, as we know, Mueller found there was no collusion between the two of them, so there was nothing really to see here. What do you make of all this, Chaz, and the extent to which some of this is justified in terms of the handling of Flynn, and how much of this is kind of just rewriting of history with a bit of a crackpot conspiracy theory?
Trump's going to have to come up with a crime before people go to jail for 50 years, I think. But let me fill in just a little bit more of that theory, just so it makes slightly more sense.
Good luck.
Basically, they're of the view that Obama was involved in the setting up of Flynn, and then the setting up of Jeff Sessions so that Trump's people couldn't control the FBI and the Department of Justice. And so then all those investigations would take place with no one being able to control them, and that would then set up the appointment of Robert Mueller, and that would then destroy, as you said, Trump's first 2 years of the presidency. So they're saying the idea was to take out Flynn and Sessions. That's how Obamagate worked, and that was all Obama's plan.
It sounds diabolical.
Well, look, this is how Rand Paul put it.
He knew about trying to go after General Flynn, and it was being directed from the White House. So I have every expectation that President Obama is in the middle of this, but I think it's worse. I think you go back to Operation Crossfire Hurricane, the whole fake dossier and all of the stuff, all of the FISA warrants that were, I think, improperly and illegally gotten started on the Trump campaign. I really strongly believe that President Obama gave specific and direct oversight and direct permission for this.
Okay, and I've got to say, to be honest, I'm actually on Bill Barr's side with the Flynn thing. I would have let Flynn go as well, but let me tell you why. Now, Flynn pled guilty to lying to the FBI, but the prosecutors did hide potentially exculpatory evidence in the case, which were handwritten notes by the FBI about his interview, and also the fact that one of the agents stopped the case against him being closed when it looked like it was about to be closed. Now, both those pieces of evidence I thought were severely overhyped, but they were potentially useful to Michael Flynn. He would have wanted to know them before he pled guilty. So at the very least, they should have let him withdraw his guilty plea, which is what he wanted to do. When he did that, they then go to court and have to prove it. And this is why I think they should have dropped the charges. They never could have proved this case because there were two agents, Peter Strzok and Joe Pientka, who took the notes. Joe Pientka was the one who took the actual notes when they were interviewing Michael Flynn. Then Peter Strzok, according to a text message that he sent his mistress, Lisa Page, he then edited it heavily. In fact, so heavily, he said he was trying to not completely rewrite the thing so as to save Pienka's voice. And if that's not bad enough, Lisa Page suggested some edits herself, and she wasn't even sitting the interview, right? So that is a complete, there's no way they would have won that case, especially given this is the FBI, right? Do you know how they take notes?
Tell me.
They use the very latest of technology from the 14th century. They use paper and pen. They don't use tape recorders. They should really start using tape recorders or maybe a smartphone. They don't record anything. So it's just notes. So when those notes have been fudged, they were never going to prove that.
Yeah, well, so on the one hand, yes, you could have pulled the prosecution case apart had it gone to trial. But at the heart of it, you had somebody who was a senior government official, national security advisor, continuing to lie about a conversation that he had had a month previously with the Russian ambassador, a telephone call which did cross a line into illegality under the Logan Act. So, you can say, look, the gathering of that evidence was done poorly, maybe they shouldn't have been even doing the interview in the first place, but you can't escape from the fact that this guy did something, and then he lied to Mike Pence about it and Sean Spicer about it, whether you think that put them open to Russian blackmail or not, which is a bit far-fetched.
Yes, yeah.
But still, the very idea that Michael Flynn, at the very least, the guy should never have been in that job, and he was rightly forced to resign after 23 days in the job.
Oh, yeah, look, and the reason he was sacked was because he lied to Mike Pence as well. Let's not forget that. Yeah. He didn't stop lying to Mike Pence because the FBI agents were a bit dodgy. So if Trump was sacking him for lying to Mike Pence...
But lying to an FBI agent, even if the FBI agent is dodgy, you're still lying to the FBI. And you're under oath.
Absolutely. And I should also say that there's been this revisionism about Michael Flynn saying, he didn't even lie. Well, no, he pled guilty to lying. So either he was lying then or he was lying to the court. Exactly.
Yeah. Which is now what Emmett Sullivan, the judge who's overseeing this, is now looking at in terms of those contempt charges. Because it's like, well, you can't have it both ways, pal.
Yeah, and I think it's fair to say as well, this is what the thousands of lawyers you referred to before are saying, that the defence they used wasn't the defence I just said, about you're not going to be able to prove the case. They came up with this spurious defence, like you said, about the investigation was immaterial or something like that, which, look, to be honest, I could kind of understand where they were coming from, except for they never make that case for anyone else. And it's like Roger Stone all over again, where you go, okay, I can understand your logic, But there is a double standard here between how you treat Trump's friends and how you treat everyone else. But this is where it gets really dodgy.
Yeah.
And this is where we get a bit more about the Obamagate. When they wanted to interview Flynn, right, the FBI wanted to send 2 FBI agents, like I said, to interview him. There's a process they're supposed to go through. And this is what James Comey said about that process.
You look at this White House now, and it's hard to imagine 2 FBI agents ending up in the same room. How did that happen?
I sent them. The FBI wanted to send agents into the White House itself to interview a senior official. You would work through the White House counsel, and there'd be discussions and approvals and who would be there. And I thought it's early enough, let's just send a couple guys over.
Okay, so he completely circumvented the process by his own admission. Then Andrew McCabe, the deputy director of the FBI, rang up Flynn beforehand and suggested he take the interview and not have a lawyer present, which is even worse. In fact, the Department of Justice's Mary McCord, and by the way, she is no friend of Bill Barr. She just wrote an op-ed this week titled "Bill Barr Twisted My Words in Dropping the Flynn Case," okay? She said in that op-ed, any such interview should have been coordinated with the Justice Department. There were protocols for engaging with White House officials and protocols for interviews, and this was, of course, a sensitive situation. We objected to the rogueness of the decision by the FBI, Jim Comey, and then instructed his Krev writing task with the transcript. There was dodginess everywhere.
Yep.
And this is where the Obamagate comes in. They say that Obama was responsible for this process. Right. You go, okay, how was Obama responsible for all these FBI agents running rogue? Okay, this comes back to that meeting that Sean Hannity referred to before, this January 5 meeting. Like he said, all the big pooh-bahs were there. Obama, Biden, Comey, Brennan, Clapper, Susan Rice, Sally Yates, the whole lot, okay? And Susan Rice wrote an email to herself about that meeting. She wrote, from a national security perspective, however, President Obama said he wants to be sure that, as we engage with the incoming team, we are mindful to ascertain if there is any reason that we cannot share information fully as it relates to Russia. The President asked Comey to inform him if anything changes in the next few weeks that should affect how we share classified information with the incoming team. Comey said he would. Now, to me, that means that Obama's saying, I know you're investigating these guys. If you're looking to see if they're dodgy, if you find anything, let me know, because if it compromises them, I can watch out how I deal with them.
Right.
That's how I would interpret that. I think that's the common understanding. Tucker Carlson, he has a different meaning of what Obama meant.
Now, what exactly does that mean? Here's what it means. The President of the United States turned to the head of the FBI, the most powerful law enforcement official in America, and said, continue to secretly investigate my chief political rival so that I can act against him. Comey's response, yes, sir. That's what Obama was saying.
Now,
yeah, I'm not sure he's right.
Yeah, that's where these guys lose me.
Yeah, right.
There is no evidence that that's the worst possible spin you could put on it.
Yeah.
And there's no evidence whatsoever that Obama said, okay, let's conspire together. But that's their evidence. That quote from Susan Rice is their main piece of evidence. Apart from that, there's 2 other things they say. One is that Sally Yates testified in court that Obama told her about General Flynn's phone call, so therefore he knew about it. Yeah, no shit he knew. Of course he knew, because he knew there was an investigation going on. The question is, did he instruct anyone to be corrupt? That's the question, not whether he knew there was an investigation going on. But secondly as well, the next day after that meeting, there was another meeting where Comey spoke to Trump, and Comey didn't tell Trump about Flynn. He didn't tell Trump about the investigations. He didn't tell Trump about any of those things. He told Trump about the Steele dossier, and that CNN were looking for an excuse to publish the Steele dossier, so watch out. CNN then published an article about Comey saying that to Trump. So then the conservatives said, oh, this is a whole setup. And it was because of that meeting, because Obama said that stuff to them. They were obviously all in it together. No evidence. No evidence at all. I'm not convinced. Are you any more convinced?
No, but what I'm interested in is the way in which kind of revisiting this period and saying, in retrospect, because there was no smoking gun found by Mueller, therefore there had to have been, if there wasn't a conspiracy from Trump and the Russians, there must have been a conspiracy through running through Obama and the deep state to try and create a conspiracy of Trump and the Russians, and it's just a parallel rabbit hole.
It is very parallel, isn't it? Like there's the same dot connecting and same speculation that there was with Russia.
I feel as though as well that there's a reason why most of the media is scratching their head about this and saying, look, this is kind of Pizzagate stuff. This is not Watergate stuff, and this is something that Fox News is running hard on because it maybe just reassures a certain portion of Trump's base that are still uncomfortable with what happened with that whole Russia thing, that this now just provides them with a fairly neat and tidy way to say, that whole Russia thing, it really was a hoax, here's what the hoax was, and it maybe just shores up Trump's base. I'm not sure that it goes beyond Hannity and Tucker Carlson's audience.
I'll tell you what I think that's all about, actually, and it relates to what happened the last couple of days. Now, do you know what masking and unmasking is? Like you have when there's a classified bit of information, like say, for instance, say General Flynn talking to the Russians. General Flynn's name is masked. The Russians unmasked, and so when you're searching for
because you're allowed to wiretap the Russians, you're not allowed to wiretap Michael Flynn.
Exactly, and so if you want to find out who was talking to the Russians, you need to unmask that person, right? Now, obviously General Flynn was unmasked. That's how they knew about that phone call that he made with the Russian ambassador when they were wiretapping the Russian ambassador, not Flynn. Now, they released the other day what Acting Director of National Intelligence Richard Grenell called a list of recipients who may have received Lieutenant General Flynn's identity in response to an unmasking request processed between 8th of November 2016 and 31st of January 2017. There were 16 names in that list, most of whom you wouldn't have heard of, like the ambassador for Italy, for instance. But there was John Brennan, and there was Jim Clapper, and there was one name in particular that stood out. Vice President of the United States, Joseph R. Biden. Now, this is what it's about.
All right.
Because this, of course, led to some very long bows being drawn by Trump supporters.
They have now found that Vice President Biden is guilty of using government to go after a political opponent.
Okay, a few things. Richard Grenell explicitly said in the release that while the principals are identified below, we cannot confirm they saw the unmasked information. Even more importantly, each individual was an authorised recipient of the original report, and the unmasking was approved through NSA's standard process, which includes a review of the justification for the request. In other words, it was all completely legal, John. So all the hyperventilating is well out of control. But most importantly of all, John, you can't unmask someone unless they're masked.
Sure.
Which means when people were searching for whoever, they can't have been searching for Michael Flynn because he was masked. His name wasn't there. They must have been searching for Russians, which makes sense because they were conducting an investigation against Russians. And then they unmasked the people who were talking sus to Russians, and one of them was Michael Flynn. So clearly they weren't going after Michael Flynn when they unmasked that person because they didn't know it was Michael Flynn.
So the conspiracy started once they found out it was Michael Flynn.
No! Look, they're going to try and stick Joe Biden with this for sure, no doubt. But maybe if Durham can come up with some evidence, this will stick. But so far, it's pretty weak gruel. They're going to need more evidence than this, I think, to make any conspiracy stick.
And I don't think they'll need any more evidence than this to keep running it on Hannity and Tucker Carlson.
That's probably true.
At the very least. Now, on Wednesday night's Planet America, we spoke to the president of the National Lawyers Committee, Kristen Clark, about the killing of unarmed black man Ahmaud Arbery in late February in the state of Georgia. Well, in this, the second part of our interview, we turned our attention to the issue of voting rights. There are numerous legal fights going on at the moment over whether all postal voting can be made available to anyone in November's election. This is not a new fight, although the coronavirus pandemic has made it particularly urgent. With non-compulsory voting in America, some fear that turnout will be low, and Democrats in particular fear low turnout will increase President Trump's chances for re-election. The most reliable voters are usually the kind of older, whiter folks who support Republicans like Trump. Republicans in turn complain that postal voting is open to voter fraud, although there is almost no evidence that that actually happens. Here's more from Kristen Clark. So, Kristen Clark, what are the major issues around voting rights as we head into the final 6 months before November's election?
The pandemic has turned our election system on its head. Already we've seen the devastating impact that the pandemic has had, really making it incredibly difficult for voters to exercise their voice in our elections. We've seen long lines in places like Milwaukee and Chicago where voters have braved lines that have stretched for blocks and that have gone on for hours as they try to both comply with social distancing guidelines and deal with polling sites that have been reduced in numbers and where there are often poll worker shortages because there are so many poll workers who are choosing to stay home. What we need right now are for states to really demonstrate the political will needed to give voters access. At my organization, the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under Law, we're championing a set of reforms that we think are critical. We need no excuse vote by mail that gives every eligible voter the option to vote at home if that's what they choose to do. We're also pushing for expanded early voting periods in advance of Election Day that can help to ease the burden that poll workers will face on Election Day and give voters the opportunity to go during a time that is convenient and safe for them to vote in advance of Election Day. But we need in-person opportunities on Election Day itself. We have communities with language needs. We have people with disabilities. We have homeless people who can't receive ballots at home. So we need to provide in-person voting opportunities as well. So there's a strong movement afoot right now to really push the 50 states to move to a place where they are doing all that they can to provide access. And where they're not, we're engaged actively in litigation and really turning to the courts to get states to do what's necessary to make sure that voters can have access to democracy during this unprecedented pandemic.
What are the reasons that people give to resist no-excuse mail voting when excuse-driven mail voting might already exist in their state?
You know, it's quite remarkable. There's some states where you do need an excuse, and those states are the most problematic. Tennessee is one of those states. You have to be fall into a category of about a dozen categories in order to get an absentee ballot. And if you don't, you're out of luck. And they actually also criminalize people who pass out absentee ballot applications. So we've filed a lawsuit against the state of Tennessee to get them to eliminate those unnecessary barriers and restrictions to the franchise. But it is unfortunate that we're seeing vote by mail become such a politicized issue in our country. It really speaks to this unique and dark moment that we're up against where everything is tainted by some kind of political outlook or where there's a desire for political gamesmanship. The truth is that vote by mail has never, it skews white, it skews towards elderly voters, it skews towards people in rural communities. But at this moment, at this unique moment, everybody in the country, it doesn't matter where you are or who you are, needs the opportunity to vote by mail. No voter should be put into the unfortunate position of having to choose between their health and exercising the right to vote.
Kristen, it's one thing to have some form of mail-in voting. Of course, in some states, they make it really easy by sending you the ballot in the first place. You don't even have to go through an application process before you can make that mail-in vote. How easy can that process realistically be made between now and November?
Yeah, California is leading the charge. The governor of California recently committed to sending an absentee ballot to every eligible voter, and he's eliminating the step of submitting an application, which frankly just adds a layer of unnecessary burden. It's a tremendously proactive step that no doubt will make it easier for people across California to have voice in our democracy in 2020. Then you have states like New York, where they're automatically sending out the absentee ballot application, which is great. It will require that second step of follow through for voters. But it's important to remember that the pandemic is wreaking havoc across communities. And there are people dealing with life and death scenarios. There are people who have lost loved ones. So it's a unique moment that really demands that states find that political will to really eliminate the unnecessary barriers and hurdles that stand between voters and the ballot this season.
Now, you say you plan to take these issues through the courts if necessary, but how much hope do you really have on that path, given the Supreme Court hasn't exactly been voting rights' friend recently?
In Wisconsin, we saw the U.S. Supreme Court unnecessarily interjecting itself in the election, and it certainly seems that this court is poised to similarly interject itself again. We're going to keep fighting. We're going to keep bringing these lawsuits in states across the country because we believe deeply that the right to vote lies at the heart of American democracy, and it is a right worth fighting for. And this is a moment where voters face barriers and hurdles that exceed anything that we have seen in modern time in our country. And so we remain hopeful. We're going to build these cases based on the facts. We're going to tell the courts about the experiences that people are living through as they all go through this pandemic. And we're hopeful that we will secure some victories in the courts at the end of the day. But we're not going to stop fighting, and we're going to keep pushing until the very bitter end.
Kristen Clark, many thanks indeed for joining us on Planet America's Fireside Chat.
Thank you for having me.
And that is all the time we have for this week's Fireside Chat. We will see you on Wednesday night at 9:30 on ABC TV for another trip to Planet America.
And that's not enough. Don't forget the PEP podcast with Dr. David Smith and me.
But to take us out this week, comedian Sarah Cooper has been doing some great lip syncing on TikTok. Here she is with her take on Obamagate. Bye-bye.
Obamagate. It's been going on for a long time. It's been going on from before I even got elected. And it's a disgrace that it happened. And if you look at what's gone on, and if you look at now all of this information that's being released, and from what I understand, that's only the beginning. Some terrible things happened, and it should never be allowed to happen in our country again. And you'll be seeing what's going on over the coming weeks. But I wish you'd write honestly about it, but unfortunately, you choose not to do so. Yeah, John, please.
Crime. What is the crime exactly that you're accusing him of?
You know what the crime is. The crime is very obvious to everybody. All you have to do is read the newspapers, except yours. John, please.